Okay, we can go. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are we? It's great to be back in sunny San Sebastian. Always like to come here to get away from the British rainy weather. We've just had a quick swap around as well. We did have a Brexit table. I was being told I had to sit on a different place than the rest of the Europeans, but I've reintegrated myself. Maybe there's a future for us yet in the European system. I'm Michael Goodman, so I'm going to be chairing this panel, and just a really quick background. I think this is a very significant discussion, we've reached, I think, quite an important stage in the development of the debate around European film. In the beginning, and I chair a film fund too, we used to give money to producers to make films. And then over a period of time, there was an understanding that more people wanted to make films than we had money for. Those films weren't necessarily connecting with audiences anymore in any strong way. And there was a problem also around diversity, which is a critical issue for us. I think what we've tried to do over those years is to try and move that money around more. And I think what was happening and has been happening is that you end up putting some money in different parts of the value chain. So you think, we'll rebalance this by putting a bit more money towards distribution or a bit more money in exhibition. And I think what we've got to in the dialogue that kind of started is the idea that we need to be much more fluid about the idea of the value chain itself, that actually the expertise and the knowledge built up in various parts of the value chain have got value elsewhere. That rather than it being a very particular set of disciplines, a very specific set of disciplines that simply don't cross over, what we're moving towards is a world in which all of that knowledge that can drive a film towards reaching greater and broader and more diverse audiences, that's now become paramount. The need for export, the need to open up new markets, all these ideas, the cultural value, the economic value, all these things are kind of coming together. And we're reaching a stage where I think the discussion now is across those traditional boundaries. What we're going to talk about here is how that translates into practice. What does that mean when it comes to day-to-day policy? What does that mean when it comes to the process and the progress of our films? So what we've got is a panel that happily crosses over all of our different areas of the value chain. And we have Artemio Benki, who is one of those, already one of the early hyphenates, who is both, works in both production and distribution and elsewhere, someone who's already, I think, pushing boundaries here. Jean Brunfort from the Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, and a very active member of EFADS, someone, I've known for quite a long time now, but someone who's always, I think, had a strong interest, as the glass falls out of my glasses, something there. Always had a strong interest, I think, in that very practical side. How do we make these things happen? Keeping a very open kind of mind. We have Berenice Arnold, who's from the FFA, obviously the German Film Institute, one of those really big players in this world. And I think another area we'll be hearing about how a major organization is rethinking the way that it's doing business. We have Ilse, and I know I'm going to get your name wrong, but I'm going to go anyway. Schoenrapp. Is that okay? That's not too bad then. From Flanders, but someone who I think it's really essential when we listen to people who actually stand back. And I think this is the relationship between academia and industry, I think, can be quite weak in this business. But I think you're just about to finish your PhD now. But someone who's been spending a lot of time looking in depth at the way that kind of the world is working, that films are being distributed and engaging audiences. Lucy Ricaldo, we all, I think everyone here probably knows from the Commission Head of Media. And media, I think some of this stuff is coming together. You've been talking about this for a long while, and I think now we'll be hearing about how media programs can support and are supporting change and where that might go. And finally, we have Enrico, who's just joined Image, obviously one of our most important organizations, and someone I think who's come in at one of those interesting times, as the Chinese probably don't call it, but it's certainly a point where you're going to be deeply involved in, I think, in a lot of the changes we're talking about. So that's the talk. It's an open discussion. The aim is to raise talking points. The aim is to raise discussions that hopefully we take forward rather than definitive solutions. But let me start with you, Artemio. Just give us a perspective. You're someone who's been deeply involved in making these changes over some years. Just give us your sense of where you think things need to be going.
I mean, this is... hello? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's my voice. I was like thinking like that really that means like because there is new funds, because the system is evaluating, I mean it's like the things are starting to be much more fluid and much more flexible. I mean it's like in the past years, I mean what we saw, it was like, I mean it was like before it was like really like producer, distributors, that was separated, and you know in something in between it was world sales. And slowly, I mean, it's like some producers was thinking that they could distribute, and they started, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. World sales, like right now, are becoming producer or co-producers. And what I think like we kind of can explore is like, why not now a distributor will become producers or co-producers, because there is the tools. Thanks to some evolution of some grant, thanks to evolutions to some grants, it's like, why not we will start distributors also to be producers, also bringing back the audience to come to see the film, because basically, I mean, the distributor will, let's say, are the expert on around the audience, or how to bring a film to a public. So that's kind of how to build a win-win situation.
And just give us a sense of how you're doing it. How are you making this happen?
Oh, I mean, I can give on a film that I'm directing, by the way, also, and co-producing. This is like a small story about how we started the financing, and how we started the financing in a way that I think a pure producer will not be able to do. The first source we decide to get as money, I mean, it's an Argentinian film. I'm a French living in Czech Republic, and I decide to make an Argentinian documentary. Super. That's normally not like going to be a great success in terms of financing. So I decided to take the money that I had as an automatic support for distribution, and I looked at it and I said, well, I will go for the module 1 of the automatic support, and I take the money and I put it in distribution, in the production. There is possibility to reinvest in production, either from the distribution. And based on this, I mean, I could go to my first subsidies saying, I'm already partly financed. And okay, it went successfully. And then after, I mean, it's like all these things, I mean, started to have a snowball effect. Then, okay, I started to get CNC, Inca, and Austrian grant, and now waiting for early image and also getting media development. But the thing is like, if it was not starting from the distribution point of view, maybe it wouldn't have worked. I mean, most of the application I was like doing to get to raise the financing for the film were demanding, okay, how do you gonna show your film? Why your film is for cinema? Why a documentary is not for TV? And I had to explain that. And if I actually, I mean, not only me, but I mean, so also my producers and co-producers were not enough clever to answer to that questions, I think, I mean, we will just simply make a small film, and etc. I mean, it's like right now, I mean, the budget is, for Czech Republic is, I think, one of the biggest documentary never made in terms of budget. But, so that's the things what was possible also because it started by thinking about the audience in the beginning and thinking about the audience from a distribution point of view, not like, okay, I will make a film for women between the age of 7 to 77, so you know what is a classic, but already defining things like this. This is like an experience.
So, I mean, you've raised a really big point straight away, which is that we've talked a lot over the last few years about producers distributing, about self-distribution. I think your argument is that that is actually more difficult in some ways than distributors becoming producers, because distributors are forward-facing, they are audience-facing, and working back from the audience into the production, as you're saying, is more important in some ways than the other way.
I mean, when you are distributors, I mean, you need to know your audience. You need to know who are you going to bring the film to. I mean, even if it is a very niche film, you know, even if it is a film for 100 people in Luxembourg, but you need to know these 100 people. As a producer, you don't really need to know them somehow. I mean, you can know them. It's good if you know them, but you don't really need this. I think, like, if you are acting as a co-producer, maybe not as a main producer, but as a co-producer, starting from the distribution point of view, I mean, it's not so complicated. I mean, it's like if I do something in Czech Republic, I have 3 possible sources. I mean, okay, I go to media, but this is a specific things for distributors. There is like 2 schemes that I can apply, 2 or 3 schemes. I go to my own grant for productions, and I know which one I should have. I mean, I can read a guideline. TV is not entering in co-production, so unfortunately in my country, so I will not have to talk to them. And I know how to distribute the film, and that's the end of the day. I mean, and then I can financially be owning 20% of a share of a film that I co-produce. It means like, and about regarding the shooting, this is something different. I mean, for sure you need an expertise, but I mean, it's like, I'm not speaking about that case.
And just one thing, so before, I want to ask Jean about this as someone who's in a film fund. What you're saying is, even within the Czech Republic right now, it is actually possible to do this within the system we've got now. It doesn't need to rip everything up. There are actually, it's a way of thinking as much as anything else.
Yeah, either with Czech Republic, it's possible. I mean, it's like, either like, it's possible maybe on a smaller scale, on a smaller films. I mean, it's like, I will say, if you are not a pure producer, it's possible on smaller film, but I mean, it's possible on, I mean, most of the film in Europe are still smaller. I mean, it's like, there's not only film from Spain, France and Germany.
Absolutely. Jean, you've been involved in funding films, obviously, for quite a long time now. It strikes me as a couple of points that Artemio made. One is that we've been talking about the need for more audience knowledge and more participation, but I wonder if you recognize his point, which is people have got used to now giving you, I guess I can, this time in the morning, I can say a bit of bullshit about how they're approaching audiences. But what we're talking about here is something much more scientific, something much more specific. I wonder if you recognize the criticism that over the years, the first problem has been that we don't really, that producers don't really have, filmmakers don't really have that relationship with audiences, and that's one of the key problems we need to deal with.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I do, but I think it's getting better. I think the image of film funding bodies not taking care of what the audience of the film they support is going away. I think we all know that film funding bodies really want the film they fund to find an audience, so it's something we're working on, and we're just not, saying we want to support this director and not care about who the film is going to be targeted for. So I think it's getting better, but still, what we do, at least in my institute, is when we fund a film, of course, one of the questions that we ask to the director and the producer is, who is this film for? What is going to be your strategy? How do you envisage the meeting between your film and the audience? Of course, there is a little bit of bullshit. It's part of it, but we know about it. And then we have this commission asking questions. And in the commission, we have distributors, we have sales agents, so they are able to keep going with the questions. So it's just not for the look, yeah, we've asked this question, it's fine. So we go a little further. And then when the film is funded, we have, when the film is almost finished, but not completely finished, we have a meeting with the producer and the distributor of the film about their strategy. And we plan the strategy together. We see what they can do and we see what we can do to help them reaching their goal. So the idea is that we don't just give the money and then wait for the result. We need to be with them, and I wouldn't say coach them because we're not experts, but we can bring an added value to the question of distribution, at least in Belgium, in a very small territory. But it's maybe because we do have in French-speaking Belgium a very big challenge. It's that our own films, our national films, do not meet the audience. It's very specific. There are not that many countries in Europe where national films do not meet their audience. But French-speaking Belgium is a territory where that happens. So we really have to take care of that because that's the biggest problem for us. So what I mean is, at least for a small territory as ours, we need to accompany the films from the very beginning until the end and until the release. We cannot just drop in the middle and say, production is done, perfect, now you go with it.
And that seems to me a really big response to the problem is you've got to start early. It's I remember a producer in Rotterdam talking about producers being like irresponsible parents who keep having babies and then handing them over to a guardian and moving on to the next, to get pregnant again. And it's that feeling that actually the responsibility for that film, the thinking about how that's going to reach the audience, what you're saying, I think, is you have brought it right back to the early stages, right at the point of development. What you're looking for and wanting is strategic thinking about how they move forward. It doesn't always work. So let's not use the vulgar term bullshit. Let's just talk about guesswork. Some of it is kind of a shot in the dark. So when people say it's 18 to 31, they don't necessarily mean that. But if there's a strategy built around that, then that's really where you're going. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a prototype industry. We never know how it's going to work, but at least what we want is producers and distributors together to think about a strategy. And if they say, well, this film is for, as you said, for 100 people who like art, modern art, and we know that's the niche, well, it's fine. Then we will fund the film if it's a good film because you know exactly who you're talking to. But if you say it's for everyone from 7 to 77, women, men, children, lesbian, gays, transsexuals, whatever, because it's a universal story, it's not enough because we need more information than that. And you also need how you're going to put your film on the market because there are films with the same subjects. There are bigger films from France, from Germany, from the UK. So how is your film going to stick out and say, well, that's the one I want to see? So it's something we're working directly with the producers and the distributors when there is a distributor, because sometimes there isn't, and that's a problem because we do think that films do have better chances with a distributor.
Okay, we'll come back. I just want to ask you, so I'll come on to Germany as well in the same discussion, is when you say distributors in the early stage, what you really mean is the knowledge that distributors bring. It's that kind of understanding of how the market's going to work. So the knowledge in that early stage is where I think the gap sometimes is, the actual understanding of how that market works. You can't just build strategy on guesswork. And I think that seems to me a serious problem. And I just wonder how we get around that issue of a lack of knowledge amongst production at the early stages, other than bringing producers into the room.
Well, I think it's by learning and having successes and failures and knowing from others' experiences that you can actually build your own experience. Otherwise, I don't think there is any, master class or whatever that would make you know exactly what you need to do. It's just by practicing, I think. And fortunately, as we're a small country, people speak to each other and they can share experiences and help each other. But sometimes you think you have the perfect strategy and then it doesn't work, so you never know.
So it's sharing, it's that early stage is about sharing all of the knowledge and value we've got. We'll talk a little later on, I think, about the value of failure, because I think it's one of these things that we all come to these events and someone sits up here and you write down everything that they think made their film a success, and quite often that's based around their own mythology of what was successful. Trying to copy best practice is sometimes not the best way of actually learning. Sometimes you get greater value in looking at what didn't work and what you could do better than the person that came before. But I think we have an issue with that I want to raise right across the board. But Germany, Bernice, give us a sense of, first of all, you recognise a lot of what Jean's saying, I think, in terms of that need for that earlier stage strategic thinking and more voices early.
Yes, definitely. We see the point of going earlier into the production, helping producers to develop a film that will reach an audience. But unfortunately, we don't have the same possibilities in discussing with producers and distributors. So we try to help producers to make better films. So one of the strategies we developed recently is to focus more on higher budget productions. So we try to give our money to less films, but to films who have more chances to reach a larger audience. This is also because in Germany we have a particular system where the FFA is more for the economically successful film, and we have the ministry who is more for cultural film. So we have this luxury also to split the support. But yeah, we are trying to go into still a lot into production, and also what we have freshly in the new law since 1st of January 2017 is that we try to focus on the script, so in the very beginning of a film production. And we had already before script writing support, but what is new now and is also in this idea of excellence funding is that we have a further development funding. So we are trying to pick out of the pool of scripts the one that already has a producer and the one who's likely to be successful in cinematic distribution. So, and we give them a lot of money, extra money to develop a successful film.
So we're back again to what I think is going to be a theme right across this board, is that it's that early stage, the interventions that can be made that can really show on the screen and really show when you're reaching audiences have to happen right at that early point of development. Now, you're talking about scripts and excellence. I mean, it is one of the discussions we've been having in the film industry a long time, is just how much script development is a problem and how much that starts showing on screen at the point where it's too late to alter it. But in terms of excellence, who decides? How are you working out? Who are the voices that are coming in and saying this is excellence?
Well, that's difficult to say because we have these commissions, and they are now. You can never say who's going to sit in the commission, but it's basically a commission who's deciding this project has potential or not. So it's.
This is sounding very German. So you've got you have a commission somewhere of people deciding on excellence.
Yeah, well, there are criteria, but basically yes.
It's the same in Belgium.
Yeah, I mean, I'm joking. Of course, we all at the end of the day have people who are making some kind of decisions. It's just one of the themes that we've got here is that the voices that maybe ought to be in that early stage development might be rather more diverse than the ones we've had before. That and not just in terms of different kind of people, but in terms of the different disciplines. So, I mean, do you do what we're hearing? You know, on those commissions, are there kind of distribution voices? Are there people who are on a day-to-day basis working with getting these, seeing the interaction between content and audience?
And generally, the commissions, well, it's a very complicated system to put them together. So I'm sorry, but I don't know the details of how the commission is put together. But generally, yes, there are representatives of all the value chain. It's in every commission we have distributors, we have producers, we have film exporters, well, international sales. So yeah, we try to have a large scale of professionals in the commission.
And you make, I think it's a really important point, the one that we don't make anywhere near enough in film panels, is this idea of the film industry, what's good for the film industry. There's a vast difference between the new Haneke film and a first-time filmmaker kind of coming through. And it's not, what you're suggesting is the best thing, the bottom line for you is you've still got to have a layer, whether it's elitist or not, you've still got to have a layer of excellence that's performing to a very high standard that's going to inspire people and make people interested and build that film culture. But that's a very different, making that work is very different than trying to turn this very diverse, new kind of set of voices, these new producers coming into the business, turning that into something that works.
Yeah, well, it's a different approach. It's basically really saying that distributors know their work, and we're trying to support this. But in order to make their work easier, we try to help them in producing films that already work. And as I said, the FFA might be a bit boring or something, but we are basically focusing on the economically successful film. So what we are trying to do is to find out criteria to pick out the project that can reach the audience and can reach a big audience, because the criteria is 250,000 entrances. So this is one of the criteria.
Okay, I think, I mean, this is the second thing. So we've got both the early stage, but it's also about knowledge again. It's about these things have worked. These are people who understand why things are working. If you can bring those into that early stage, maybe you can build on other people's success. I just wonder, just before we move on, I mean, again, learning best practice has its limitations. You know, there's also the problem that you really want to learn from people who didn't succeed in order to move forward. I wonder if that's part of your thinking.
Well, it's not the main focus, but for example, what happened just yesterday in Utrecht is that we organized together, the FFA with the Netherlands Film Fund, we organized an authors meeting where we bring together Dutch and German authors, and we make them meet on one-on-one meetings with experts from both countries. So yeah. The idea behind that is, I think, very interesting, because first, it is a classical author meeting where people meet, and so you can bring people together and initiate co-production, but also these experts have a mission, and this mission is to give advice how they can write a script, so at the very early stage, a script that could be an international production or something that could work abroad. So there's also the idea of bringing together, but this is a very specific thing we organized. It's not structural, so yeah.
Yeah, although it is in a way, sorry.
Yeah, just to say, we have also a system where once a year we assess all the films that were released the year before with the producer and the distributor, and we go through what went right and what went wrong. And it's very interesting because it's open to all the members of the commission, so at least they can see what the film that they voted for has turned into, and what is working and not, and maybe it can influence their judgment on the next film, either from the same director or on the same kind of film. And it's very interesting because we're talking more about failures than about successes. And it's, I think, as you said, sometimes you learn more from what didn't work or went just the other way you thought, than from something that you knew exactly what you were doing and it went just the way you thought.
Yeah, you know, with the terms failure and success, we probably need to get past the pejorative nature of the terms. And you know, in software development, for example, you talk about fast failure as being a good thing, not a bad thing. And I think that's that sense that you're learning from other people's knowledge and bringing that back into the system. It seems to me both of you are doing that in your different ways. Let me take this. You know, you've been looking at this from a broader perspective. You've actually been able to stand back and take a look at it. I just wonder, you know, the themes that are coming through at the moment are probably about how we throw away knowledge, actually, and how putting that back into the system, allowing more fluidity, more voices at an early stage. Is that something your studies kind of recognize as critical?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. But I feel like that's something I should add here is that if you look at the broad perspective of the whole of Europe, is that it's only, well, not a small amount, but a couple of like funds that do it. And I think it's also sharing knowledge between distributors, producers, but also between funds. And I feel that we need to maybe step back a bit from that idea of cultural protectionism that came from a very long time ago, of course, but there's still very much a reluctance from funds to bring in distributors and sales agents. So I think that's also an important element to add on there, and if we can learn from funds amongst each other also about that, I think that's also a necessary element to put on the table. And maybe added on to that is, I think, making films when working on scripts very early on, why not also let people guide scriptwriters, let distributors help also with the guide. I think the education part is very important here also, because we're funding very young people to write scripts, but we're not educating them in why they are writing it and for whom they are. So I think those both elements is something I think are also necessary.
Do you think from your studies that people understand each other's disciplines? I mean, I think one of the things that came out in the producer, the self-distribution thing, which hasn't ended, it's still an important part of the discussion, but what became clear quite often in the studies that, and the practical case studies, is that producers didn't actually understand what it was that distributors did. And it seems to me there's still a bit of a kind of knowledge gap between the different disciplines.
Absolutely, because I think that for a director, for instance, the distributor is the money taker, and it's the one who makes everything bad. And then, and I think that's also one. And then a producer, they're looking for a distributor, and if they don't find one, then maybe it's the fault of the distributor. And I think let's bring them together in a more also just an exchange, not like just selling films, but also bring them together at like tables and have them discuss what is distribution for you, what do you need from me as a distributor, what do you need from me as a producer, and let's bring it back together.
I wonder if again, the language, it seems to me, is part of the problem here, that what you're talking about here is value and knowledge is what we're trying to gather here. It's not just distribution. I always think distributor is one of those terms that really completely underestimates what it is that distribution actually puts into the equation. It's not just going around with tins of film, as in the old days, handing it over to someone. There actually is a really important part about how you connect, how you engage, and that value and knowledge, it seems to me, is still getting lost quite a lot in the system, and partly because perhaps we aren't thinking in the right way. I just wonder whether you recognize that problem of lost value within the value chain.
Well, yeah, just like I think what you said is exactly. I think again.
I always like it when people just say, what he said. That's good. So when you must have come up with some conclusions at this. You've looked at all these things now. What to you seems like a system that would work? Because you can have power without responsibility here. If you were sitting, I always think there's a great conference to be had somewhere that was, if the film industry didn't exist, let's try and reinvent it and see what it looks like. What would be a system that from your perspective would work better than the one we've got now?
Well, I think the whole idea of focusing too much on production, and it's good to give a lot of money to make creative and very qualitative content, but maybe it's like we've discussed it here at the table already. Let's not just put money in production, but also from a very early stage put the money already in distribution, and that's what European funds also especially do. So let's make a national fund maybe more like a European, and European maybe more like a national. Let's bring it back together So,
is that partly that there are a lot of interests in here? You know, when people have got a degree of power. I mean, whatever, we don't like to talk about this, but, you know, a chair of a film fund, there is a certain amount of power you get, that when you start collaborating and listening more, that power, your personal power may be going down. The power of what you can do and achieve could be going up. But it still seems to me there's quite a lot of vested interests in the industry that are quite difficult to get past.
Well, and I think the whole, like maybe I said before, we all want to protect our own culture and our own filmmaking, and I think even from a funding point of view, why not always fund films that are just for your own region? Let's also fund films for the whole of Europe. Yeah,
and that's Jean's point, I think, as well, that actually, as long as there's some strategic thinking in there and there's voices there, it can work. Yeah, please.
I think it's a simple thing to understand. I mean, it's like, what is the story of a film? I mean, what is the career of a film? I mean, it's just starting with an idea, with some guy who is having an idea, you know, or whatever, if it is a producer, distributor, or whatever, and it's ending up when it is reaching his audience. And these simple things, you know, I mean, it's like, who looks like very much of a cliche, you know, it's something which is really very often forgotten, or was very often forgotten. I mean, it's like, let's look at big country production where 300 films are produced and 200 are distributed. So, I mean, it's like, that's a point what we are talking about. When you reach distributors earlier, or when you reach a longer development, and when you think all the way around, so that's the, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that backs up the point you're making. Lucie, I mean, in some ways, this follows the logic of what you've been trying to do within media, not always popular as a result, but that sense that we were hearing there, that sense of a more of a fluid form of distribution, one that captures value and allows it to go. Just could you give us a sense of the thinking behind some of the current support mechanisms that are there, and how the Commission's now, or how Creative Europe's now thinking about moving from where we are?
Good morning. Indeed, we started looking at the way media is working these days, thanks to the very fruitful and constructive dialogue we initiated a couple of years ago in the context of what we call the European Film Forum. And actually, as a result of this dialogue, we realized that the challenges across the value chains were the same, but the solution to address these challenges were very different and very silo-orientated. So we actually thought, because the challenge of reaching out to the audiences, promotion of European works, making content that can travel are all the same. So we actually thought, well, what can we do in constant dialogue with industry and with the member states to really try to de-silo the way at least media is working today and really have greater impact to address those challenges. So, as I said, we realized that media has, to some extent, been instrumental in creating a mindset of collaboration in Europe, but that we may need to take it to the next level. And actually, between now and even after 2020, we would like to see media as a sort of icebreaker in terms of really taking collaboration to the next level. So what we started looking is, for example, is that under media, we have promoted collaboration between producers, or to a certain extent between distributors, but there are no schemes allowing actually producers and distributors and VOD platforms to work together. Well, also we realized, for example, that under our distribution support schemes, even if there is already collaboration ongoing, the schemes actually could be improved and enhanced, again, to really bring about greater synergies. So I think that's the phase we are at this moment, is really, I think we will try to, for example, on distribution, to sit together with the distributors themselves and see how we can work together, how the schemes could be tweaked between now and 2020, really to make them more, I would say, impactful. But I would like to add something that is important for us. It's not only collaboration with industry, it's also collaboration with the film funds. For us, it's really essential, and we see us that have a relatively small budget complementing the action that is taken by the member states. And in this sense, we have also initiated a dialogue with the EFAs that I think has proven to be very, very successful. For example, we have been discussing with them promotion, which is, I think, a common challenge for all of us. And since a representative of Euromage here, I think there is also potential for collaboration between media and Euromage, certainly something that we would like to explore in the future.
I mean, de-siloing, I won't use that term, but it is exactly what we're talking about. It is much more of a challenge than it sounds. And one of the problems that you have when you're trying to bring together programs like that is there is the danger of it becoming bureaucratic, because you have to create measurable value. That's part of what you have to do. And that seems to me part of our problem is that if you didn't have to measure these things, if you could just sit down together and say, we'll try some things out and we'll come back with the results, it would be fine. But as soon as you have the need for measurable value, and as soon as you have to have structures around these, you find that you get people who are brilliant at getting the money out, people who are brilliant at doing the structures and miss the big picture about the value that ought to be there. Is that something that concerns you?
Well, this is precisely the reason why we have engaged in such a close dialogue with the industry, because sometimes media has been successful and could be victim of its success, because we are very bound by the schemes we have today. So I think we need to take a step back and say, what are the challenges? What are the objectives? And then say, what can media European level do and do well because we bring European added value? And what are those aspects that media should not do because these are perfectly covered by member states or by industry itself? And if we engage in a dialogue, it needs a very good understanding of the challenges, and where we bring value to the whole picture, I think the risk that you have highlighted will be certainly diminished, because then we are part of an ecosystem where we contribute modestly with our resources. But if you see the broad picture, I think it's much easier.
Yeah, we'll come back when we're having our discussion. I think that the notion of an ecosystem is one that's growing, and I think it makes sense. But in that ecosystem, you've also got you've got the big players, and we're thinking about how do we make big films better and better performing in the export market. But we've also got new talent. We've also got people who I suspect some people in this room who are trying to work out how to work the way through a system which doesn't work like it used to work in terms of career development. It's actually quite difficult. So making the big film stronger. And at the same time having cultural value which can actually be seen on the ground, and bringing new voices. And the diversity debate, it seemed to me, caused a big problem for us that hasn't gone away in any way. You can have more women making films, but the diversity debate opened up the whole idea about whether we as an industry really are the meritocracy we like to think we are, and how far those new diverse voices can be brought in, because I still think, I understand if I'm an established filmmaker why the German Film Fund helps me, and I understand from a media perspective, but if you are a new raw film talent from a diverse background that's underrepresented, it still seems to me we've got a long, long way to go in that challenge in working out how to create a participatory audiovisual culture.
I think that both aspects are entirely compatible, but not perhaps every action, every scheme is suited to these different objectives. So perhaps for the time being we have tried to do it all and through all the schemes. And perhaps what we might need in the future is greater differentiation. How we can bring this new talent? How can we support it? And I'm convinced that media has a lot to add to that. But perhaps the solution, what works for a big budget with high potential movie, is not the same solution or the same that we need for a low budget movie. And this differentiation is perhaps something that we need to discuss for the future.
So we're back to flexibility and fluidity, which seem to be the Fs of the day. Hopefully no more Fs of the day. Image, I mean, you've already been mentioned a couple of times. I mean, it's an organisation that I think, and again, I apologise for the UK here, but there is, but Image, it seems to me, does have a critical place to play in this. If we are going to have the kind of system we're talking about with more fluidity, with more dialogue, that's really a place where I think you're going to be playing a big role.
Yeah, I agree with you and with everything which has been said so far by the other speakers, in the sense that it's paramount that cooperation and coordination between the different actors is played out to its fullest. With regard to Image, actually, it could fill this gap that you were mentioning before when you're referring to cultural new directors, new talent to be supported. Because actually, being a cultural fund, one of our missions is actually to give a possibility to all voices to be heard. Of course, one of the limitations we do have is financial resources, constraints that everybody has. But in our mission is a cultural fund specifically focused on co-production. I know that you don't like dividing value chain and these kind of things, but unfortunately our regulations still refer to this kind of work. And in our mission is actually to support diversity in the film co-production and the international cooperation at this level. So I think we are very complementary to other, like I was very glad to hear Lucia saying that there's room for cooperation. I think that definitely there is great room for cooperation. It's also the way Eurimage was established from an historical point of view that presents that all in all we kind of filled the gap that the European Union could not deal with historically, and this is still the case. So even for distribution we do play a role which is complementary to the one of the media program. When they changed for the beneficiary countries, for example, we change our own focus in order to kind of target our limited resources to those countries that can profit the most. So from my point of view, it's clear that there is a complementarity, but unlike some national funds, from what I've heard, we are more interested in the diversity, in giving opportunities to young talent to take the front stage. But this being said, of course, what was also interesting to me was the discussions regarding how commissions work. I mean, this is how decisions are taken. This is an issue that each and every organization is confronted with, and sometimes, it can have some drawbacks as well.
It's a really important point. You're talking about a structural issue here that the distribution voice coming back could have all the value that we're talking about, but you are still tied to a certain extent by a set of rules. I just wonder how, and that's true of all organizations, it is difficult to make changes within big organizations that allow for that kind of flexibility. I wonder if you've had any discussion within Eurimage at the moment about how that might be changed, or is it an ongoing dialogue within the organization?
It's actually an ongoing discussion that we have internally and with other partners. So it's something, since the environment is moving so fast, we need to try to keep following with our missions. But we do have yearly meetings just, for what we call strategic, which is actually policy meetings where we try to set our goals and try to mend those rules which we can actually act upon. So we have a fine-tuning of our rules year by year. But of course, it's very limited. This is very, very technical. It's very navel-gazing, if you wish, kind of exercise. But we do try as much as we can to adjust to the situation we are confronted with. So, I mean, even in distribution, rules have changed quite consistently from our perspective in the last 2-3 years. Of course, for the market as such, they can appear to be limited in scope. But, that's what can be done at our level without, our rules are set by Committee of Ministers, so we are bound, but whatever ambassadors have decided.
It is an issue here at the moment, because what you're talking about with media and with the film funds and with Eurimage is you have to offer a degree of leadership. In order to make this thing happen, of course, you need there needs to be a lead from the top to an extent. But it seems to me that there is still a problem in that you want to devolve more of those things down. And one of the things that I always think is the strength of distributors that gets underestimated is they know their local area. I mean, they have to sell in that area. They have to work in that market. When it comes to the value, that they will know down to a much deeper level what someone in Ghent thinks about a particular kind of film, how that culture works. But you need the top, but you also need a much greater level of devolution, I would argue, where the voice is in there. I mean, you were talking about film funds. I chair a regional film fund, for example. Regional film funds also have a big role to play here. It seems to me I just wonder how far we think there's an institutional problem that needs to be dealt with first, whether we think that we've got the structure right of big organizations and small organizations and those do we have a structural problem, or is it just a matter of adapting what we've already got to the needs of a new world?
I think Lucia would be much better placed than me to reply to you. With regard to distribution, of course, for us it's a very small project compared to a program, compared to co-production. So when I say we adjust, we very much look at what media do in order just to complement. We have a different membership, so we try to concentrate, to target our support to those countries who cannot benefit from the media program. So from our point of view, it's it's you know, in distribution it's a little bit different from co-production. You know, we have a very limited amount of money that we try to get most of the value from. And for us, the way is just, you know, to take a look at what media does and try to complement with regard to our membership.
Let's come to media, but I just want to, because I'm going to open this up to the floor, but I want to ask you this question, because this is one of the things about co-production that I think has begun to be understood, particularly as it's so essential to smaller countries to actually get their films made, is distribution in its broadest sense. Let's get away from distribution. Audience engagement in terms of co-production ought to be one of the great values of co-production. That ought to be one of the main aims. But I just wonder whether, you know, the fact there's a debate about it, there's a discussion about it, it's still seen very much about co-production where distribution is an add-on, rather than what seems to me a really incredibly valuable part of what Urimage could do, is to become the organisation that is all about the distribution, the engagement, the audience stuff, and takes that right into the heart of the development process that's largely being pointed towards producers.
Well, I see your point, you know, but to a certain extent, you know, we're confronted with the history we have, and from my point of view, it's clear that, you know, that the audience is an item, you know, which is always considered when, you know, the board of management decides upon co-productions. In a sense, you know, it's, I don't know, theatrical releases, you know, what kind of an audience, how many countries could possibly be interested in this kind of product. But we are also interested in producing, you know, films which we consider valuable, regardless of the audience. You know, yeah. Just, you know, from our point of view, that's what I was trying to say. You know, I heard what the German fund is aiming at. You know, it's not quite the same thing. It's very difficult for us because we have different conflicting objectives to be met. So it's very much the discussion taking place in different fora, you know, which may lead to decisions being taken. And all in all, in any case, for us, the two paramount or three paramount principles is the quality of the film, the diversity, so the value, the new message which is being conveyed, and of course the international cooperation, which is a conditio sine qua non for us to go ahead, you know, because that's our raison d'etre, you know, the reason why we're there, to enhance international cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, we'll open this up to the floor, but it is a very interesting discussion here about just how radical, what is it we're talking about here? When we talk about moving across those value chains, are we just talking about a little more conversation between organizations and disciplines, or actually we're talking about something quite a bit more fundamental that opens up quite big questions about the whole nature of the value chain, about the whole nature of the systems that we currently have to support film? So even when I'm hearing about quality, you know, we're about quality, that's fine, and I understand that, that's what we're talking about, but who decides? It seems to me an issue around diversity, it's an issue around relevance. So I'm not quite sure at this stage, and that's a discussion I think to have amongst yourselves, just how, when you push this to its ultimate degree, if you take this conversation to the far end, just how much of a radical set of ideas might emerge. But let's open this up to points first. Anyone got any questions? Yeah, one here. Can we get the microphone somewhere?
It's a question about distributors. Sorry, this is John Hopewell from Variety. Coming in early on films, I wonder if this is not only to try to make the film better, but also in a scenario where the number of films, at least non-popcorn films, which really perform well at the box office, is a very limited one. It has been for some time. And either you get in first or you don't get in at all. If anyone could comment on that, on my cynicism.
I think this is exactly the idea behind this guidelines, the FFA release at the end of 2016. This is exactly the point that we say, okay, we have too many films, and most of them are average quality. That might sound a bit harsh, but at the end of the day, that was a problem people faced and distributors faced. And they said, okay, we have a lot of films to distribute. First, it's a lot, and we can't bring them all into theaters. And also, nobody wants to see them because they are not exceptional. So this is exactly the idea behind this whole thing. And I just wanted to maybe add something to this guidelines. I didn't mention it before, but it's also the idea behind it is not that the FFA is only focusing on commercial films. It's more that in Germany we have these different layers of film funding, starting from the regional Länderförderer and federal structures like the FFA, but also the ministry. And the idea was just that a producer knows where to go for a film, for a specific film. It's a bit what John said. When the producer thinks it's a small audience film, very special niche film, then he knows, I don't need to go to the FFA, I'll go straight to the BKM. And what happened before is that they applied everywhere, and everybody gave a little bit of funding. And so at the end of the day, we didn't have any visibility, and there were a lot of films who might not have been chosen if they were just on the right place with a lot of money. So we think we have to refocus everybody on its core business.
Just a very quick follow-up question. If you're talking about distributors talking to producers or getting in on films early in their cycle, what happens to sales agents? Or are you just talking about distributors on national films? Or are you talking about international or...
Well, I was speaking, I don't know what happened to sales agents in that case, but I mean, it's in a way, well, I don't know what's happened to sales agents, you know, what? What?
You can't release the film everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. You cannot release the film. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you cannot release the film everywhere. I mean, I don't think like national distributors have an expertise worldwide. So I mean, it's like that's not going to change their existence. In a way, I mean, it's what you are bringing is like you are bringing an expertise with pretty valuables, you know, when you enter early. I mean, and nowadays, I mean, distributors enter passively very often in an early stage. I mean, they pre-buy films on scripts very often, you know, so. Why not to change it to, okay, let's be active, you know, instead of just pre-buying the next Haneke, let's be part of it. I mean, it's like the last, and many titles who are in Cannes, I mean, they are bought 1 year before or something like this. I mean, one year before to be shoot. So, I mean, it's like, now I'm saying, okay, let's buy it 1 year before, but let's be part of it. That's slightly...
I think John Zever, you've raised a really, the key point here, which is, to an extent, it's about risk as well. I think one of the things here is, are the problems of those films that are recognised completely? When we say there's too many films, we say how many mediocre films there are, how many boring films there are. What we're really talking about here is, is about how we can make our films increase the value of those films. And that means taking more risks, not less risks. Someone had a Netflix story last night. Sorry, it was very strong wine. Who had a Netflix? Someone was talking about, it was you, wasn't it, Jean? Tell us your Netflix story, and then we'll...
No, it's just that I was at this workshop, and this guy from Netflix was telling that the CEO of Netflix actually realized that they had too many successes, is not enough failure, and that was actually scary, because it was meaning that they were not taking enough risks, and that from now on they wanted to take more risks and maybe have more failure, but that would be the idea of making new attempts and being more in research and development than being on building on successes. And I think that's something that film funds in Europe are very aware of. They're there to take risk. As you said, we already know that if the Dardenne brothers come with a movie, it might be a good movie. I mean, there are not too many risks on that. It's the same for other Belgian directors, but there are new ones that we need to try to help in order to see if they can actually build a career. So we really need to be behind them, and it's something that we were very aware of, I think, in all the film institutes in Europe, because it's that's the future of our cinematography in Europe, and we have to be aware of that. We cannot just build on the existing ones. We need to keep going with the new ones. sometimes there isn't any new one, and that's scary. And that goes back to film schools, and that's also another issue that I think is very interesting, but I don't think that's the place.
Well, there is a kind of place here, and it's a discussion that you might, other people might want to come in on. The Netflix example is what, to me, is part of the discussion here, and why distribution being involved in those earlier stages may make a big difference. Netflix operates on big data. It's the techies in charge here. It's a big data company, and the fear we always have in film is that if the more audience knowledge that's put in, the less risk you take. You decide this is what the audience wants, so we're going to give them more of it. In reality, I think there's a lot of argument that the opposite is true, that we don't want to take risks because we don't understand what the boundaries are. We don't understand how to push those boundaries. And I think in a lot of cases, the discussion we're having is what happens in it's one of the frustrations in a film fund, and I'm sure you both have this as well, is you get new diverse voices in, you bring them in, you send them through a lab, and basically they're tamed. What you get back is a not very good version of what they think an art house film is, whereas what you want, and maybe it's because I'm an old punk rocker, you kind of want something which is going to challenge, that's going to kind of blow you away, something that's raw and adventurous, that's exciting. Now that to me is a very strong argument for having distribution and that knowledge in at the early stage to make better, more adventurous and more exciting films, but making sure that the inevitable failures that come out of that, you learn the lessons from them when you're pushing forward. So I think, the discussion here is, is our system actually kind of pushing people to make mediocre films? Because that is where I think a change in the value chain could actually make quite a big difference. You're kind of nodding, Bernice, as if you agree.
Well, I think that's exactly what I said when I was talking about the guidelines, the mediocrity of the films done. So yeah, I think that this is exactly what we try to do, is to fund excellence, like I said before, in different ways, and to also we don't want to produce only. You might not even know it, but Willkommen bei den Hartmanns or films like that. We also want challenging smaller films, but we have a specific funding scheme for that, and it's at BKM. And so it's more about dividing the workload and also the budget, so that everybody has an allocated budget for a certain type of films, and that everybody can give more money to the film who needs it. So BKM, there would be an application for a smaller film. They could really concentrate on that film and say, okay, you are on the right address here, and we give you more money than before for your film because we believe it's going to reach your...
Actually, she's going to make it simple, and then we'll come to you. Sorry, can you hold on one moment?
It's just to say that we have the same reflection about the fact that we don't spend enough time on development. So what we're doing now, we're thinking about taking part of the money of production to development and writing. We used to have a small amount of money for that, but actually we would rather have more money for that and then stop the project if it's not good enough, instead of allowing the project to go into production and then see the results and go like, oh yeah, oh, well, not bad, not good, just in between, which is the worst, because you won't go anywhere with an in-between film. Yeah. Either it's very bad, and sometimes it can work because it's really bad, or it's really good, but just in between doesn't work. So we are now trying to slide the money from production to development, and also more money into distribution.
Yeah, so bad it's good is not necessarily a big category in European film, but you raised a point I want to bring up again, but it's just from...
It's a bit the same as, because you said put more money in development, but I think it's also necessary, especially with the young directors, to also fund the distributors and taking that risk, because they tend to only buy films where they know from their own experience that it would be good. But if you never worked with a young producer or a young filmmaker before, I think that's also an add-on to the whole story.
Yeah, it's very interesting to listen and see how national funding in two countries is evolving, because that also raises questions about our own funding from media perspective, because of course, until recently, we were one of the very few funders on development and one of the very few funders on distribution. And perhaps there is a trend from member states to invest more on early stage pre-production, but also on distribution. Complementarity is certainly a crucial issue where we need to see how the different funding complement one another rather than overlapping in a context where public support is decreasing. Because I think this is something we should not forget. There is not more public money that is being put, it's less funding that is being put. So we think that for us what is clear is that we focus on what I said before, is how we can add relevance and added value, but from a European perspective, which is our, I would say, specificities. And here perhaps that means that the networking effect, the collaboration across borders, collaboration across the value chain, and also perhaps taking risk and really looking at new modes of experimentation might be the niche where we can perhaps add the strongest value to what the member states are doing. I would also like to say something about the data, because I think this is a crucial element where we all need to work together. And we have, for example, identified that through Europa Cinemas, just to mention, there is a wealth of data that actually could be useful for the whole value chain, for the whole industry. So that's the kind, again, of projects where we see that media could contribute perhaps in really try to find some data and share those data for the benefit of the whole industry.
Yeah, I mean, collaborative data is one of those discussions that we need to be having more widely, and one we could talk about. But I just want to get back to which I think was the interesting point that John. Your perspective is always interesting because you've been looking at this industry for a very, can I say, a very, very long time, probably. I think that the point here is our problem, is the philosophical issue, is one of the problems we have in terms of films not performing, that actually there is a level of conservatism in those films at various points. So the incentives to take risks is not very high at the moment. When economic times go bad, the incentives actually to try and not take risks. So actually the distributors are quite often underestimated heroes and heroines in this, because actually sometimes I still meet distributors who will take a risk on a film on the basis of a gut feeling, and you kind of think, I'm glad it's your money, not my money, but there is that sense of a belief behind that stuff, but it becomes, the incentive to do that is less and less at the moment. So the argument is, if you could put more of that knowledge, if you could put more of that data, if you could put more of that distributor experience into the early stages, maybe the film that you make is more adventurous, more risky, and because distributors have been involved with it at an early stage and understand this and have worked strategically on what it might be, you might end up with a much better film that they'll be much more inclined to take a risk on.
Well, it's actually already a trend. I mean, it's like what we are speaking about is already happening. It's not an idea. I mean, it's like you were speaking about the Belgian fund. The Czech fund is doing exactly the same now. I mean, the French fund is doing for already ages, that kind of thing. So it's like, and there is more money in writing step. There is more money in the development right after, and there is more money in the distribution schemes. So, and they are asking the involvement of the thinking about distribution already in an early stage. So this is something like with really going on, and is going to go on much more often, much more. So I mean, it's like we are on an optimist actually way. I mean, we are not speaking only about the problems. It's like if this is disappearing, and that's a good way actually. I mean, this is just like obviously the film will get produced, will get better, and they will reach their audience anyway. I mean, it's like that. Oh, this is what we try. No?
Okay. Another point. Anyone want to make a point here? I don't know whether people feel. I don't know whether people are feeling optimistic or whether they look at this and, to be honest, whether they see a threat to their or a concern about their own business or the way things go. Or just think this is a terrible idea. Has anyone got a point to make? There's loads of you. I know it's early in the morning, but and I know you're wet. But someone's got a view on these things, I'm sure. No one has any views. on the future. That's good news, because it's that kind of forward-thinking, risk-taking, open discussion that I think will drive us forward into the bright future that we're envisaging here. Let's go. I mean, if you think of something, throw your hand up and feel free to jump in at any point. Let's go back to you, Atemi, because you were making a point about optimism, the way people are looking at these things. It's still pretty rare. I still think there's a major idea at the beginning, which we're calling de-silo now for forever. Is that a word that businesses are using? De-silo? Yeah.
I think it's a commission, but we will be happy if we can. Yeah. It sounds commission, right?
It sounds very European. I can't say that anymore because it's going to sound like. When you say you're optimistic, what you really mean by that is that you think that the system is opening up to this already. Is it opening up far enough? Because I don't see that happening in. I see on a having a distributor coming in and chatting to a distributor at an early stage. That's kind of happening. But what you're talking about here is the potential of a much more engaged process where that's happening all the time. That's happening routinely. That's part of the way that we think about making films.
I mean, it's not fully happening right now, but just the tools are starting to exist. I mean, it's like they are developed in the phones, but we are asked to think about distribution in a very early stage. We are asked to really develop a film during a longer time and much more. I mean, it's like let's look at things who are asked now. I mean, it's like further. I mean, in the past, I mean, we had like to write 1-2 version of a script. We didn't have money to write it down because that was this. So we had to shoot pretty quickly. All the money was in production, and then in distribution. So let's put it in the cinema because, and anyway, some of the time, I mean, on some European film, it was even not really needed because like you get paid before. So I mean, it's like that was not needed to put it in the cinema. So nowadays, I mean, it's like you say, okay, well, there is much more steps, and they are actually granting us to use to do it. So I mean, it's like, so that's the way saying that it's going to get better, because just like, I mean, there's like, even from a financial point of view, I mean, there is finance to really rewrite your script. I mean, imagine that's 10 years ago was not really existing. I mean, it's like 10 years ago I could, as a producer now, I mean, I will put out my hat of distributor, but as a producer, I mean, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I couldn't go to my own national fund to ask money to write. So my writer, my screenplay writer, was starving, working in a bar, and he was during night. If he didn't drink too much, he was writing his script. Finally, you know, I could. No, but don't cry. I mean, he was not writing the script at that time, you know, and it was. But now, I mean, he can go to that fund, and the producer can go. He can reach some money, I mean, to be able to write his film, and to write it like 6 times, like Americans does, or like Brits does, you know. I mean, it's like there is much more version to be done. Same, you know, when it's like the distributor is involved, we said like, okay, all these grants, we say, okay, yes, good, we want to give you money to make a film, but we want to have this film to be shown. To be, I mean, one of the conditions of a rematch is to say, for example, okay, you are 2 or 3 countries, make sure that you will get that money because this film will be at least in these 3 countries in the cinema. And don't fool us up, you know, by saying, okay, you don't do it. Otherwise, we don't give you that money. So I mean, it's like, it's an important. That's why I would say that's a trend with like a positive trend, you know. So, yeah. I don't know if I may.
It would be useful then. I can see. So what you're saying is, look, the thinking has changed already. We're already at the stage where we know something needs to happen. What we're now looking at is and what we'll do in these in the last few minutes here is, I think, try and put together what we think is a structure that might work, and how this. And identify where the problems lie if this is going to happen. I think the first point, I just want to go back to John, if I may, actually. John, you will make it, what we're talking about here is structural changes that could put more value in, I just wonder if it's your conception that in any way that's the issue for European film, or whether there are problems for European films in them. I just wonder what as someone who's a commentator over many years on this, what is your conception of where the problems lie, and how much when we go through here it's actually going to make any difference?
I think there's been a sea change where now, at least in European film, if you're talking about what typifies European film, which is art film, or art house film, where the number of films which can make substantial money, at least in theatrical terms, is limited, more challenged. And that means that I think that there is a increasing emphasis on originality, on films which are really out there, and if that is one thing. At the same time, you can see not only distributors but sales agents getting in very quickly on titles. We've announced, I think, here in the dailies we do something like 3-4 deals, and they've all been sales agents moving in on films which are not completed films, but films still in development. Yes, I think you can see from European Audiovisual Observatory figures that the part of funding which is growing in national terms is development, which is extremely, extremely helpful. And also, to a certain extent, distribution, more than production. But I wonder if they are growing enough. But at the end, I think it's people knowing talent. And there are not enough. If we're going to talk, then I will be talking to people not only in my own country, certainly after Brexit, and also I think people seem limited. If you're going to take risk, as you say, you should know when you're taking risk. And people are not taking enough risk, but I can understand that because the risks are far, far higher now. So, sorry, that was a bit kind of, I don't think that was of much use at all, but still.
I think you're right. I think it was useful. I think what we're trying to get to here is what are the systemic problems that we're dealing with. And I think the point here that when we go through here, I think you've raised a couple of really big points. One is that more films are being made, but actually identifying talent within those films is really critical. So repositioning, so we're focusing on development of talent, is I think what the film funds here are, and indeed media, are trying to do more and more. But that some of that is about taking out the stuff which is mediocre, as well as putting in putting more power and energy behind the films that actually, or that talent that looks like it's got potential. And it still feels to me like we're a little way off. Having a system which and that's where distributors can really come in, identifying that stuff that really might work. It's that early stage development still seems to me the problem area. Sure.
Well, I think we're all working on it, so might be a problem now and might not be a problem after, hopefully. Well, as you said, everyone knows that the weakness of European films, I think, is in development. We need more time, more money for development, and it might end up in less films, but at least those ones will be the ones that deserve to go into production. About the way, the positive thinking about changes. I think everyone understands now that, and distributors first, that the changes that are made into the policies led by film funding bodies are for their interest. For instance, in Belgium, when we realized that the fact of simply giving money to distributors and producers for releasing the film was not working well, and we decided to take back some of the money in order to have our own activities, in order to complement to help them having their own activities, then it's working. And they didn't say, we don't agree, we don't want you to take back part of the money to have your own activities, such as we have screenings for trendsetters, we have bought space for our trailers in the cinemas, we have bought space in the newspapers, and we're having all those activities that actually are a little added value to their own work. They didn't say, you can't do it, we want the money back and we want to do it by ourselves, because they understand there is a strategy of putting the European and the Belgian films more to be seen by people. So I think they understand that that we're working with them, that we're not working against them, and that we're just trying to make their efforts get better results. It's just, I think it's a change of mind, because 10 years ago, we would have been arguing about the envelope and saying, no, we want to keep the money and you won't have more. And we would say, no, if you take this, then we take this back. And it's not the same idea. I think we're all now working into the same direction. I think it's a good point.
Okay, so what we're going to do, did anyone have any last points? Because we're going to kind of have a quick run through the panel. No? Okay, well in that case we're going to end up with you going away enlightened, because what we're going to try and look at, I think, is just at the end, the interventions that I think might be needed. But I just want to put that point again, and John put it very well. If you're going to have strategy, you have to know things that currently, historically, we haven't known. Risk isn't just a shot in the dark. Risk, it ought to be based on, if you're going to have a strategy around risk, as you've been trying to do, you need to have a very clear sense of where those dangers are, what those problems are. So bringing knowledge back into the system seems to be essential to be able to have that understanding to actually put out those risky films. And the point that I think, which is why I think Europa Distribution have put this in, is that development historically has been, let's bring in experts at script writing who can tell you what's wrong with your script. I think what distributors are able to contribute is more, here's how what you're trying to say works in dialogue with the real people that we see on the ground every day. This is how, when we're going into the cinemas, when we're going out, this is the stuff that we know actually makes an impact. And I think that's a very different thing when we're talking about development. It's not just professionalization, it's also about an understanding that comes from the audience back. So what I want is just everyone to give me one thing that they think, if the world that we're looking at here is one with much more fluidity, much more knowledge going back into the system, much more understanding from audience being fed to producers, much more of the knowledge that is built up through production, including failure, being brought back in to improve the system. Just give me one thing from each of you that you think we need that would be very useful to actually make that happen. Tell me, start with you.
No, I mean, you just said it. I mean, it's like to start to risk, is just something needed, and just the tools are existing for it. So let's just do it.
And public, this is about public funds as well. You think public funds cover?
What I said, tools, is public funds.
Yeah.
I mean, very often to be able to risk is also to have it a bit financed. I mean, I'm very now direct, but if you have 20,000 to write a script, I mean, you can write it easily, much more in an easy way than if you have zero. I mean, that's simple.
Well, no, expand on that point. So it is the critical point. I mean, it comes down to where the finance is going to go. It comes down to the support that we can give. I get called a tool as a film fund all the time, but it's I think I just get called a tool. But from your point of view, it is as simple as that. It's about rethinking your priorities as a fund.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, that's nice and easy. Bernice?
I think it's a very challenging question for me. I think in an ideal world, I would maybe think of something like Jeanne did in Bologna, because I think the dialogue between the different professionals, especially producers and distributors, is very important. But I'm afraid I will have to talk to Peter if we can do it in Germany this way. So I'm sorry, but I don't have a very brilliant idea to put in on this.
Well, no, I mean, this is the art of the possible. We have to work out what can be done within frameworks. If one of the arguments and one of the problems is that the frameworks aren't really there in place. So I think what you're saying is the film fund that you're looking at is going to be brilliant at making films that already have that potential within the market go that much further, that you'll focus on smaller numbers of high potential, in the opinion of your secret commission, rather than ones of low potential. That seems to me that's a strategy. But are there things missing in Germany now underneath that actually would help other parts of the system, and is that just not your responsibility?
Well, it's not directly my responsibility, but I know that it's also part of the guidelines. It's the young producers funding, well, to foster production from offspring producers. So this is kind of a young talent support that is one of the goals for the next 5 years from the FFR, but also from the other federal and state institutions. So I think it's also maybe could be part of a strategy is to pick talent very early and to help them in a certain way to grow. So. Okay, so we're not there yet, but the thinking. It's only in the beginning right now.
Okay, cool. Jean?
Well, I think the challenge for us is to remain flexible. I think we need to adjust to the different kind of films that we support. For instance, I think that the tools, to go back to that expression, the tools that we use need to be able to adjust to the different kind of films. For instance, you do not have to bring the same support for distribution to a film that is on this subject or on that with that budget. And it's very difficult in a public funding not to apply the same rules to everyone, because there are rules that say that you need to treat everyone equally. And I think that's maybe not the good idea. You might have basic rules that needs to apply the same way to everyone, but then you need to have some kind of flexibility and freedom for the institute to decide that you want to put more money on this for this film, or you want to help them to achieve this because this film needs it. And it's something that is not very easy to accept for governments, because of course, there might be people saying, why did you give more to this film than to my film? And that's why you need to be able to explain and argue. Fortunately, we're such a small territory and we don't have that many films. So people do accept that we might not behave the same way with one film than with another, so it works. But I could easily understand that it might not work in France or in Germany, where the amount of films is so big. So I think flexibility and being able to adjust the policy to different kind of films is very important.
And I think you're also making the point that you need strength of resolve as well within your own organizations, that people don't necessarily like change. I'm going to just throw you in one thing, because my other hat as the chair of a film fund as well is we made the rather radical decision a while back, which follows some of yours, to say no film gets funded other than at that early stage development. And what we do is everyone has to join a collaborative network right at the beginning. You have to join right at the beginning of your film. Every bit of knowledge, every bit of data we've ever gathered is available to those filmmakers. But we also bring in other industries, which we haven't talked about here, but we bring in book publishers, and we bring in games developers, and we bring in other people to ensure that there are other mechanisms potentially at that early stage for making your IP. And what we're finding actually is with distributors, when we're bringing all those distributors come in at that early stage, is quite often they're also very open to a lot of the ideas about how IP might be developed in other ways as well. So I think there are a lot of new ways of doing things, but you will have resistance. That's the bit when we're talking about everything we're saying sounds nice, but if it's not your film being supported, you're not going to like it. If you feel it's not the industry you wanted to go into, you're not going to like it. And there is a necessity, I think, for leadership and risk, and you've just got to accept you're going to have things thrown at you. So, but at the end of it, it's about the value that you put back in. It's the value of the film that counts, not the institution itself. Ilse,
Well, I think from my perspective, it's more of a general thing that I think is still needed, and it's let's all work together on that mentality and bring producers and distributors and directors on the same level, and by what everybody else has been saying, bring them together in those early networks at that very early stages. But I think we are in need of a structural way of doing it, and actually putting it into the fund and saying, okay, we're making this film, then this is the stage where we're all sitting around the table, and then we're going to go further and further and further. And I think it's more of a general...
Are you speaking to funds? When you say that to funds, are you finding funds that you've spoken to, are they open-minded about this kind of thing in your...
Well, no. Of course, the one that I speak most to is the Flemish one, and they are a bit more reluctant, of course, to that, and they're more focused on the one thing I said before, the more cultural protectionism of it all. And yeah, I think we can't be afraid of a distributor, and sometimes that still happens too much.
I know some distributors I'm afraid of, looking around the room. Lucia.
Well, I think we have been speaking a lot about the value of collaboration. I think now we need to walk the talk and really see very concretely that this collaboration pays off. So from our side, if we could have a couple of early success and really bring about changes that show that really this is a nice way forward, I think that could help in changing the mindset and really, changing the mindset. So I really look forward to the discussions that we have just started with the distributors, sales agents, and VOD platforms together to really see how we can best support access and distribution in Europe. Final comment, I think you spoke a lot about taking risk. I think that means perhaps rewarding success and accepting failure. That's part of the game. So acceptance of failure is really the price of taking risk.
Yeah, and I think you were saying that...
Can I say something? I think we have maybe to imagine that to create a special grant for good fellows. So you get very interestingly and successful, but you can't get a prize for it or some statue or something like this.
So what we should do is set up a fund for films we know are going to fail. So the worse the film, the more chance you've got of getting funding. I like the sound of this one already. I just want to just very quickly suggest. I think it's a psychological thing, but it's also a practical thing. Psychologically, you're saying we need to be dealing with the fact that risks develop failure, but I think you're also saying practically that failure can be turned into data, which can be recycled to create value. I think that's the point, isn't it? Enrique, I'm leaving it to you as the last word here.
I'll be very quick. First of all, I agree strongly with Lucia. Cooperation at European level is paramount. I think, there's some work to do after our talk. And just, with the focus on image, I would like to say, you talk about risks, about, the value chain. It's also, from a geographic point of view, it's also nice to go beyond Europe, like the UK, for example. Or, leaving jokes aside, Canada, for example, has just joined. You didn't like it, okay. But Canada has just joined Image. We try to look, beyond the borders of Europe, and I think, this could also be an interesting input for our reasoning.
Okay, well, let's just sum up then. It's a big discussion. I think what we know is that there is a feeling that there's a reason to change. That I think that we've got past barrier one, and it took a hell of a long time, that actually it's a good idea to talk together and to share that kind of information around. We shouldn't feel bad about it. Actually, the analog, the value chain was set up for an analog system where you had different jobs. It was a different set of schemes when you were moving around physical objects. You were creating things physically. We're now in a different era where the tools for cooperation are far greater than they ever were before. And I think we're hearing that amongst the film funds, the psychology has changed. There is an understanding that not only do we need to start thinking about developing at an earlier stage, we also need to have the maximum number of voices in there. I think there's also an understanding that when we're talking about failures, we're not talking about most films. If you took on terms of box office, we're talking about the vast majority of films don't make their money back at the box office. But I think we stop thinking about failure and start thinking about how things can be learned, what things can be learned. I think the argument of Europa distribution here, and I think it's a very strong one, is that the distributor voice and indeed the exhibitor voice as well, but the distributor voice are the ones where I think you are day-to-day working in a market environment where you've actually got to be listening and talking to audiences and understanding them. You are the ones taking the risks. If you can bring that knowledge of risk back through the system, I guess sales agents will see themselves involved as well. You can bring that knowledge back in. It can help create stronger films with stronger opportunities and allow you to build, which is Jan's point, strategy. And strategy is not the core strength of the film film production. It's a lot more hit and hope still, I think, than most other industries. I think it needs informed strategy, and informed by other parts of the value chain and elsewhere. It seems to me like one of the things we're all agreeing on is a good thing. What we're also saying with distributor voices coming in is that it should allow greater risk. If your fear of failure is greater than your desire to actually create something which is challenging and moving forward, then we are creating mediocrity. And I think what we're talking about here is more knowledge, greater strategic thinking should allow you to take more risks, and out of that risk we might find the more exciting, adventurous, dynamic, diverse kind of European voice that I still think in some ways is lacking. And I'd put you a challenge that maybe you'll have your own version in your country. If you put together every film of the last 10 years in the UK and then sit down, watch them all, and then say, now tell me what that's told you about an atmosphere that would have led to Brexit. And I think you will find that it doesn't tell you that. I think you'll find that none of that kind of, we are too narrow still. We need to build out. We need those different voices. Diversity has to mean more people coming in. But it's, in terms of diversity, I think distributors have to deal with diversity because they have people and audiences at the end of it. I think from producers' point of view, the knowledge of the ideas of diversity, I think, can be sometimes quite narrow. So we're saying that in all these ways, you put all of these ideas together and you've got the opportunity of a system which is collaborative, which is networked, which is knowledgeable, which is willing to take risks, which learns from risks. This all sounds fantastic and dynamic. I think the challenge for you to all go away with and think about yourselves, and maybe you'll be forced to by film funds over the next few years, is what does that actually mean structurally? Do we really have a system that allows that to happen? Are we talking here about a nice, cozy arrangement between us all that's nice and neat, where the tools are already in place? Or are we going to have to take quite radical thinking about our organizational structures, about whether we're talking to the right people, whether some of the people who have got the most influential voices are always the ones that should be given all of that power? Are we listening? Are we interacting? I think all of this stuff points towards a changing ecosystem, and that may be a challenge that we're going to be talking about here for a very long time. But in the short term, I think it's probably time to go back out there in the rain and get ourselves soaking wet and drinks. So thanks everyone, thanks to the panel.